Hello and welcome everybody, I'm a Proper Variant. This is Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 32. This one is all about colonization, which is honestly after Hearts of Darkness, so after the big expansion for Victoria 2 on this topic, which is honestly a good system that we had in Victoria 2, still quite arcadey. We had colonial power, right? We just had points that you spent on colonizing, but there was of course this consideration of life rating, there was this consideration of others maybe also being active in the same region, making it so that, you know, they can compete with you for a colony, ultimately sparking a crisis or making it so that one side just backs down. This was not a bad system, and this system that we have here in Victoria 3 feels like a bit of an expansion, because all of a sudden no longer do we just have empty lands in Africa and so on, in Indonesia, etc. No, instead we have a situation where there are decentralized nations and they play a role in this as well. It feels much more organic when crises spark, right? And how crises can spark. We're going to see this in this dev diary. And most importantly, I would also like to say that of course the colonial PowerPoints are now a bit more organic, I would say. I wonder what the role of the fleet in full will be, because I didn't really see it here all that much, but we're going to see that, of course, as we progress through the dev diary. In general, I would say this is quite the organic revolution, so it's much more organic now, but when it comes to the actual mechanics, it is a normal evolution, so there's nothing too strange about the changes that have been made compared to Victoria 2, Heart of Darkness. Good evening and welcome to this week's Dev Diary. This is again Daniel Tollmann. Today's topic is colonization, which in Victoria 3 terms means the process of establishing and expanding colonial states in regions owned by decentralized nations. So instead of the empty land, this is now everything oriented towards decentralized nations, which just makes it more interesting, but also ultimately has a very similar vibe in terms of how the interaction went in Victoria 2. Right here you can see the Colonization Tech. Colonization Tech is an Era 1 tech, meaning it is quite easy to have. This is also written down here, meaning that the basis of it, and for example, you know, if you want to build a Suez Canal and you are Egyptian, then, you know, hey, it sounds a bit weird that you need to know how to colonize to actually build the Suez Canal in yourself, but at the same time, it is one of those topics where you can say this is just a time lock, and it is a very early time lock. Very simple colonization, basic colonization is very easily accessible. You can see that what is tied to it is +2 max colonial affairs institution investment, which is important because of course the colonial affairs institution dictates how well you can do when it comes to, well, colonizing, right? Then we can also unlock the colonial resettlement law and the colonial exploitation law with this technology, and as I said, build the Suez Canal. As the population grows, it becomes possible to go elsewhere and find new, mainly unclaimed land for the taking. This unlocked colonization laws, as we already saw, as well as the colonial affairs institution, which affects how quickly your colonies will grow. In 1884, the Berlin Conference initiated the scramble for Africa. Hungry for new resources and global dominance, the great powers divided the continent between themselves and began a relentless campaign of conquest and colonization, establishing colonial governments to oversee their new domains. That is exactly how it went when it comes to the speed of colonization, especially early on into the game until, you know, the 80s. You want to have it fairly slow, you want to have it not all that much in terms of investment, and that has to do, in my opinion, it should have to do both with the technology, so how much you can invest into the institution, but also, quite frankly, with population. So first of all, of course, how much population do you have? How well is it going for the population? But second of all, there was, especially in Germany, a very decided push once the Kaiserreich was formed. Of course, you may have heard of this. Bismarck was against colonies, right? He was not interested in holding them. He saw them as a drain of resources and as something that is essentially a powder keg that could turn, you know, for example, Great Britain, Russia, France, and so on against just Germany, so ganging up on them. And the idea of this was, though, that all of a sudden the population of Germany, or much of the population of Germany, said we want colonies. So this was an ideological shift. This was a shift that could be represented in interest groups and whatnot, right? So I would be a big fan if that also played a role there, not just the fact, okay, in the 80s, historically speaking, we had these colonies. I do hope that, of course, this takes place, you know, where the ideology of pops actually changes, rather than just, hey, look at this, you can colonize more now. It should be a demand given by the pops, as far as I'm concerned. You can establish colonies in strategic regions where you have declared an interest, and within those strategic regions, you can colonize a state region in which at least one state is controlled by a decentralized nation. So this is good, because what it means is that no longer do you just look around the map and say, oh, look at this, I can colonize this, I have my naval base that is large enough, I have my ships that are enough to give me the colonial PowerPoints. No, now instead you actually have to declare an interest, and this is important because declaring interests is an opportunity cost, or rather it comes with an opportunity cost. All of a sudden you have to say, okay, I had a declared interest in Iberia and now I no longer can intervene in Iberian conflicts. I think this is really good. I like the fact that this is involving the strategic region interests. Once you've selected a location, one of the provinces in that state region will be the starting point for your colony. Having a colony in a state region does not give you a monopoly on it. Other colonial powers can create competing colonies, resulting in split states and messy borders that are sure to generate diplomatic tensions in the future. So, big ups for this yet again. A lot more organic, a lot more natural how it goes in than how it goes in Victoria 2, right? Will probably make for absolutely disgusting borders, just truly horrendous, but I like that we can create new split states here based on how we, colonize and then start certain crises. You're going to see how the crisis model plays into this a bit further down below as well. Colonial states are a special kind of state that is created by establishing a colony in a decentralized nation or conquering territory from an unrecognized power. A colonial state that borders a non-colonial state belonging to the same country will lose its colonial status and become a regular unincorporated state. So, if I'm not mistaken here, what this would mean is that if I add one of the... let's say I own all of Africa, right? Just as an image. If I own all of Africa, and I move one single state from colonial state into unrecognized state, and I mean, we would basically do this fairly regularly in Victoria 2, you just need 1% bureaucrats, and then you can go ahead and do that, right? Add it to your proper state family, but this would all of a sudden make all of Africa an unrecognized state rather than a colonial state. I'm not sure how easy it will be to move from a colonial state to being a non-colonial state, right? But it's an interesting choice, certainly, because, hey, there has to be some way that it works, right? Anyway, I can't really explore that further, just really got me to think about that. Colonial states have a bonus to migration attraction and are affected by certain modifiers from colonial laws and the colonial affairs institution. Since colonial states cannot be incorporated, your institutions do not apply there, and pops living in these states cannot be taxed and will have a very little political power to contribute to interest groups. Fair enough. Very much fair enough. Gives them a different flavor, gives them a different nature of how you interact with them. Now, why would you want a colony? Primarily, you'd want colonies to gain access to more natural resources that you may be lacking at home, especially goods required for more advanced manufacturing production methods like rubber and dye. This next sentence, I do not enjoy at all. Once your colony expands enough that it's the largest state in its state region, it will become part of your national market, giving you direct access to the goods it produces, assuming that you ensure market access. Doesn't this mean that if France and Germany colonize... Let's say this is one state, right? France colonizes all of this, and Germany colonizes just this. Doesn't this mean that this is still in the French market, so I don't actually get its resources? Honestly, we talked about this at length. Split states, how the markets behave. We got developer comments on this topic that basically stated we don't want this to be this way anymore. This was just a part of an earlier market model, and yet we're here. I do not like this. I'm very worried about this, because it would ultimately mean that you either take the entire state region, or at the very least the larger part of the state region, or you are going to have an oddly ahistorical confusion going on there, where your colony trades within the French market and delivers all of its products to the French market, which wasn't really the case. Yeah, I'm not entirely certain. Honestly, if you know more, if you see any other developer comments, let me know what you think. But we've talked about the state and state region and market issues so much that I really wish that it was different. Now, a handy progress bar lets you know how soon your colony will expand with a corresponding tooltip and nested tooltip breaking down in increasing detail exactly why it's growing or not growing at the current rate. British colony in British Gambia, progress towards gaining an additional province, 0% currently. The next growth of the colony is estimated to occur on 20th February 1837, and apparently in 50 days. That is pretty fast. Progress increases each day by 2% due to colonial growth generated by Great Britain, 3.29, max growth per day, 2%. So basically, we are overshooting this, and we could probably be colonizing somewhere else to get, a 2% on two different locations rather than 3.29, with 1.29 being wasted right here. Great Britain is generating 6.59% colonial growth from 16.5 million incorporated population, so the number of population seems to play a role here, because they do need to migrate, of course. This is then split between one colonies, and as you can see, this is the result right there. The rate of colonial growth is determined by your incorporated population and modified by your colony growth generation speed, primarily affected by your investment in colonial affairs. So that is the institution. Bring the institution up, have a large incorporated population, and you're good to go. Honestly, thinking about it though, maybe... wouldn't it be good if you did incorporated population divided by incorporated states? Because if you are Russia, right? honestly, I'm thinking about this. I don't know. If there is no population pressure, because you are huge, even if you have a huge population, but it's equally spread out so that, for example, the average rate of people living, you know, on 1 square kilometer is lower than in Prussia and so on, would those people really migrate? But anyway, I mean, this is just mathematics at the end of the day. You need something to determine what your growth is, so I get it. Okay, the more population you have, the more pressure you can put into the colonies. As well as by local conditions in the state region. The more colonies you have growing at once, the less quickly each colony will develop, though you can selectively pause and resume colonial growth in a state. Once a colony grows, it will expand into neighboring provinces owned by a decentralized nation within its state region. Fair enough. This is, again, very much makes sense. It also does mean that the decentralized nation has its own... Do they have their own markets? I think they do, right? Has its market within your colony until you expand just enough. Which means that you can't have just a port. Yeah, honestly, that issue will never let me go. Early in the game, the colonization of most regions will be a very long and painful process due to the prevalence of malaria and other hostile conditions. The technology of the time did not allow the European colonial powers to penetrate far into Africa, but with the development of quinine and malaria prevention techniques, this would cease to be the obstacle it once was. In Victoria 3, you will need to develop your medical technology and invest in your institutions to overcome harsh penalties to colonial growth in the most inhospitable regions. So, outside of the institutions, this is a direct evolution from Victoria 2, right? The institutions demand that you invest something that previously wasn't really a topic. Yes, you did need to invest into the Navy. I'm not reading anything about the Navy here at all, but I mean, I don't know how they do it. I don't think the Navy has this role in this game, but the actual thing about medicine, about malaria prevention, about machine guns, which the machine guns will play a role, at least that is what the everything you need to know, or everything we know so far post from Liana said. But looking at all of this, this is just a direct evolution from Victoria 2, so nothing too radical, nothing too underwhelming. I think this is just right in the sweet spot. Now, of course, you can't expect to claim and exploit vast swaths of land without some resistance from the people who live there. While a colony is growing, it has a chance to generate tension with neighboring decentralized nations. If tension rises too high, the decentralized nation will begin a native uprising, a kind of diplomatic play, against you to retake their homeland and expel the invaders. I really, really enjoy this. This is such a good way of having crises develop without doing it in the winner-takes-all sort of state in Victoria 2. Again, in Victoria 2, if you compete for land, if you colonize with somebody else, then ultimately, if you both don't back down, this will end in a crisis. You might have a war, and you might be stuck in that war for a couple of years until you defeat them for literal nowhere. You know, like, the land didn't even really matter. You just needed it to get to the good land, that sort of stuff, right? And this is now in a much more integrated fashion, integrated into the diplomatic play way, where if somebody does have a declared strategic interest in this region, or if they have strategic interest just because they or some of their vassals have land there, you're looking at a situation where they can say, you know what, pay me off, or I will be on the side of the of the native uprising. I think this is a really good way of doing it. It is much more flexible and makes it so that you two can be colonizing at the same time in the same region, and then can choose selectively to join each other's diplomatic plays or not, you know, depending on it. So this is a very, very nice step in my opinion. Tension will slowly decay, but on average, you can expect the factors advancing tension to eventually outweigh its decay rate. Though it is very likely that the native inhabitants will be technologically outmatched by a colonial power, there are some factors that give them a fighting chance. Firstly, the colonial power needs to manage the logistics of transporting an army to the region, while the decentralized nation has the home advantage. Secondly, other nations with an interest in the region can join the diplomatic plays on either side. If France, for instance, has their own designs for dominance over West Africa, they might decide to support Kabul in their struggles against British encroachment. So the explanation for why decentralized nations ought to exist the way they do is that they can start these plays, which is absolutely vital to get this dynamic development in colonies. I'm a big fan of this. This also means that if you stack one side, so for example the native side, too much, this means that the other European power just loses all of its colonies. Big fan of this. Again, this is a big question about, you know, the interaction with the natives right there, and I think that this is handled in a much more organic fashion compared to Victoria 2's ways, but again, just a direct evolution. Colonial laws are typically supported by the armed forces due to their jingoist ideology, which causes them to advocate for an aggressive and expansionist foreign policy. The industrialists, ever seeking new sources of profit, especially favor colonial exploitation, while the rural folk fear for their livelihoods if their agricultural jobs are replaced by cheap colonial labor. Makes sense. This is, of course, a decision, and these institutions, or rather this law here that we have that determines how we interact with our colonies, It is good, it is very good, because it makes colonialism into a political thing. I mentioned this earlier in Germany and the pro-colonial, organizations, associations that founded themselves in this time period, and I'm a big fan of them making this into a political issue rather than just, do you have the points to colonize? If yes, then go ahead and do it, because this basically guarantees that you will have a struggle and hopefully also a bit of a pressure. If you don't want colonies, there will be pops, there will be interest groups that will want colonies, ultimately making it so that they push you into a direction, this being one of the laws, right? Colonial resettlement, and then we have no colonial affairs. Let's take a look at this. So colonial resettlement plus 100% migration attraction in unincorporated states enables the colonial affairs institution, and then colonial resettlement is providing colonial affairs with, so this is the institution itself, plus 40% colony growth generation speed multiplier. That is quite nice indeed. Then we have colonial exploitation. What does that do for us? Here you can see that is very good. Minus 25% tension decay because you are much more aggressive in what you do. Plus 10% throughput in unincorporated states. Minus 1.0 standard of living. Plus 50% migration attraction, and enables the colonial affairs institution. And what it does to it, it also adds, actually now that I see it, it adds the same growth generation speed multiplier to it. Alright, I guess in that sense they are both all the same. You just need the law because you don't get that bonus at all when you do not have colonial affairs because you can't have the institution. Anyway, those are the laws, and that is of course very interesting because it makes this into a political, into a domestic issue, and that is where all gameplay mechanics of Victoria 3 sort of feed into, right? They all say warfare, trade, everything feeds into the economy, and the economy feeds into your population. So this is quite nice to see that this is now also the case for the topic of colonization. One of the most important factors affecting tension decay is your colonial policy. Colonial powers can choose between colonial resettlement, which encourages migration to colonies, and colonial exploitation, which improves building throughput in colonial states at the expense of reduced tension decay and standard of living for pops in those states. Alright, and then the summary, I mean, we've just been walking through it, so this makes a lot of sense. I will say this sort of mechanic is really good. I personally enjoy what they've done here. It's just a normal evolution, but it makes it much less arcadey, much more organic. I really hope that the pops play an adequate role in it, and of course, I mean, you know my take, I wish it weren't so, but it is what it is, right? Next week, I'll be handing you over to Overloaf of Monthly Update Video fame, who will talk in more detail about the decentralized nations of Victoria 3's world map. Very excited to see that as well. Let me know what you think about this system in the comments. I will see you later, alligator.